Statistics really is about once we have data, what do we do with it? And that leads us to inference. So, inference is the process of drawing conclusions about a population on the basis of sample data. So, once we know something about our sample, we can say something about our population. But because this isn't a census, we are likely to have some error or give ourselves some wiggle room. So, we call that the margin of error. So when we sample randomly, if we're doing a really good job of getting a representation of our population, we're still likely to be slightly off from the actual truth about the data we're studying. But so that area that is a boundary of we're going to be close, but it's somewhere just slightly above or slightly below the actual information about our population. That's called the margin of error. Now, we can also improve our sampling by increasing the sample size. Increasing the sample size will decrease the margin of error. If you think about it, that just makes sense. If you can get more and more sample, a larger group from your population, you're more likely to get a better representation of your population. So you're going to be more accurate with your results. A sampling frame is simply the list of individuals from which a sample will be drawn. This can be limited. Theoretically, your sampling frame should be your entire population, but sometimes that's not possible, or also poor sampling methods can reduce your sampling frame, making it smaller than your population. And that could lead to undercoverage. Undercoverage occurs when some members of your population cannot be chosen in a sample. Undercoverage can lead to a biased sample, so a poor representation of our population. A common example of this would be homeless people who unfortunately cannot be reached or tracked, and so they are very much underrepresented in a lot of our information that we know about the public. Non-response is another one that can lead to undercoverage. So don't get these two confused, because sometimes people think that non-response is the only reason for undercoverage, but it is not. It would be anybody we cannot access for any reason to be part of our sample. Non-response occurs when an individual is chosen for a sample and cannot, like the homeless, be contacted or refuses to participate. Those both lead to undercoverage. So non-response is we've selected you, but for some reason you cannot respond or you choose to not respond. This is commonly confused with voluntary response. So please don't confuse those two. And voluntary response is who ends up in our sample. So let me explain the difference between the two. Involuntary response, that is when individuals choose themselves to be part of the sample. In non-response, when we're using the term non-response, we've randomly selected individuals for our sample and they are not responding to what we're asking them. That's how the two are different. So voluntary response is, hey, I'm going to go ahead and volunteer to be part of your sample. That's the difference there. It's one has pre-selection of the sample and the other it does not. So we want to avoid response bias as much as possible. So any influence from external factors on the response of individuals is a response bias. There are so many things that can influence a person's response when completing a survey. If you walk up to a group of friends and you ask them a question, and you ask maybe two people in the group, they are going to want to answer like their friends would answer. That's a response bias. Whereas if you ask them individually, they may answer differently. Also, the wording. Oh, wording is so important. How you word a question can influence the answer. The way a person, an interviewer, so if you're doing the sampling, the way you look can influence the person's response. There are so many biases that people don't even realize when they're doing surveys, and those you want to minimize as much as possible by making a very neutral survey or very neutral method of getting information. So I kind of answered that last question, but I want you to really fill that in and think about different things. Put that as your last response there. You might even want to look at, I believe it starts on page 226. There's a lot of good examples of different things you should keep in mind when doing research.